Hi, I'm Ben Kaufman, also known as Who's Gonna. Previously, I covered the Docker file I used for Kamailio. Here, I'm going to show how I would run this in a production environment. My philosophy is to use systemd as a wrapper around the Docker daemon so that if someone else attempting to work on the server without prior knowledge of how the daemon is configured will have a minimum amount of surprise. Commands like sudo service Kamailio restart, stop, sudo service Kamailio status, so on, will just work as expected without any surprise. Examining the Git repo project with tree will show an etc systemd system kamailio.service file that can be used as the systemd unit file. Start by copying that file to the root etc systemd system directory. The file's copied, but we need to enable it with systemctl. Now, before we get too far down the road of controlling, let's take a look at that file. The top section is just a brief description of the service as well as prerequisites. The Kamailio proxy needs Docker service to be running. The service section defines a type simple for the service. Restart always. If the container should crash, it'll restart automatically. The base image of the container, in this case, is from my repository. If you're using your own container or something else, put the base image name there. The image tag will default to latest, but if yours has a different value, populate it here. These values get concatenated so that the full image name passed to Docker will be container image, image tag. An env file is required to be in user local etc kamailio.env. Even if it's an empty file, it can have nothing, but that is the best way to get per server configuration values into Kamailio. The volumes environmental variable is intended to be used for mounting any additional volumes into the container as needed. Generally, I would recommend building an image containing your actual configuration files. However, in some situations, you might want to mount additional directories. For example, in development, you might want to mount your development directory to etc Kamailio in the container. This can be done here using the Docker syntax. Extra Docker args provide a way to add arbitrary arguments to Docker run. This will be uncommon and is why the value is an empty string as default. An example of why this might be desired is to use an alternate logging engine or to provide some other special configuration to the container itself. In a little bit, I'll show how to use the extra cam args because this image is set to log at notice level, but I would prefer this container to run at the info level. We'll do this by passing extra -d to Kamailio. The exec start command is the command that's executed to start the daemon. This is Docker run. --rm means the container should be deleted when it stops. The container name will be Kamailio. This is hard-coded so that it's predictable to other Docker commands that need to interact with the container. Host mode networking is used. I've encountered some performance issues with Docker keeping track of large numbers of UDP socket connections, so for production workloads, I opt for host mode networking. The env file argument points to the env file environmental variable we defined. It's worth noting that the environment variables we set in this file are not directly passed into the container. The key value pairs in the env file are accessible inside of the container, however. Both volumes and extra Docker args are empty strings by default, but if any overrides set in the unit file for these values would populate here. The full container name is the container image environmental variable, followed by a colon, followed by the image tag. Finally, extra cam args is also an empty string by default, but again, any overrides will be populated here and passed to the Kamailio binary when the container starts. The stop command is user bin docker stop Kamailio. The container name matches the name assigned to it above. The install section's wanted by is multi-user target. This is standard for this type of systemd service. As noted, we need to touch, just create an empty env file for now. So make our directory, and then we touch our environmental file. We've enabled this. The last thing we need to do is we need to do the systemctl daemon reload. So when running with the systemd, logs are going to get outputted to the journal rather than syslog. Some modern OSs may not even have syslog installed, specifically AWS Linux. Amazon Linux does not have syslog by default. Let's tail the journal. Sudo journal ctl -u Kamailio, the unit Kamailio, -f for follow. And we have some from some previous testing I did. However, switch the screen and we should be able to sudo service Kamailio start. And we can see it's running. Now, as I mentioned, we're only logging notice level logs here, so we don't see the info logging we would normally like to see. Let's take a look at how to do that. I'm going to leave the journal tailing here. I'll switch back to the other window, and while it's tempting to edit the etc systemd system kamailio.service file, the correct way to do it is with an override via systemctl. So sudo systemctl edit Kamailio, and we can just put any extra things here. We will need to create a service section. Add environment, extracam args equals -d. Now, just saving this file is not enough because of the way systemctl edit works. We need to save and exit this file. We will restart it and watch the status. We can see the -d flag has been added onto the end of this. And if we go back to check the journal, we now see all of the info level logging dumping out here. So this is great. But what happens when we want to update the container? Normally, I would tag the container with something specific and do that. So let's look at changing it from the latest image tag to the 6.1.3 kitchen sink image tag. Again, run sudo systemctl edit Kamailio. Now we'll set the image tag to 6.1.3-kitchen sink. Save and quit the file and restart the service. We can see it's now running the 6.1.3 kitchen sink image. We don't see a whole lot different in the journal, aside from that it has been restarted. If you remember, we installed cipexer on this image. We can launch another image using cipexer as the entry point to send in options to this Kamailio instance to make sure it's functioning. Docker run --rm -it -entry point cipexer. who's gonna slash Kamailio colon 6.1.3 slash kitchen sink UDP colon 172.31.77.166, which is the LAN address of this server. And we see that we got back a 200 OK from Kamailio. That's a quick overview of how to deploy this using systemd in a production environment.